I chased having an agent for myself, and it took a couple decades to figure this out that I didn't really need that. What I needed was to develop relationships with talent agents. That was actually more meaningful and useful. Agents can't really make money off an indie film director, and so they just don't have a motivation to help you.
This episode is sponsored by Pelaplan.
Welcome to Off the Lot. Today I am flying solo as Ken's on a production right now, and we all wish him well. But you're going to love today's guest, and I'm incredibly excited and thrilled to have Dan Mirvish with us, a filmmaker who turned rejection into a revolution. When his film Omaha was rejected by Sundance in the mid-90s, Dan didn't sulk. He co-founded a film festival of his own called the Slamdance Film Festival, which has since launched the careers of Christopher Nolan, the Russo Brothers, and Bong Joon-ho. The New York Times called him a cheerful subversive, and he's lived up to that title by forcing the Academy Awards to rewrite their rules, fooling major news networks into a political hoax, and writing the best-selling book, The Cheerful Subversive's Guide to Independent Filmmaking. Currently teaching at Chapman University while co-producing a Macbeth on City Bikes film in LA, Dan continues to innovate, recently pioneering the idea of self-labbing techniques with universities and creating unconventional distribution strategies that put his latest film, 18 and a Half, in over 800 libraries across 46 states. Dan, welcome to the show. And there you go. There's the 18 and a Half DVD.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks for having me on.
It's a real pleasure. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go a little non-linear with you and ask you the question, how do you define being a cheerful subversive filmmaker?
Well, it's all right there, right there in the name. I think I try to have fun. I try to have fun along the way. I think at any stage of filmmaking, it can be a drag, whether it's the financing side, which is definitely a drag, casting, production, all sorts of things can go wrong, post-production, selling the film, all kinds of things can go wrong there, and it can be very depressing, and you're getting a million rejection letters at every step of the way. So if you're not having fun doing it, or finding the fun or the humor in that whole process, it will be very demoralizing. So you'll probably wind up quitting at some point, and probably you should if it's not fun. So, because it certainly isn't financially, exciting. So you might as well have fun along the way. So that's the cheerful part. And then the subversive part is to say, look, Hollywood and the world of film and entertainment has these rules because it's a game, and like any game, it has rules, and the trick is to find and if you just follow those rules, you would never succeed, because the odds of succeeding are so minimal. So the trick is to find the loopholes, the workarounds, the different ways to subvert those rules and get around them, and find your own definitions of success. And that's the subversive part, I guess. So stick it together. You got cheerful subversive. But again, it was the New York Times that came up with that after doing an interview with me when we started Slamdance.
And Slamdance was the film festival that you founded. What was the origin story of that, and how did that come about?
Yeah, co-founded. Yeah, there were a bunch of us. But basically, I had done a film called Omaha the Movie, which technically counted as my thesis film at USC. I was in the grad program at USC at the time, but we shot it on 35 millimeter, edited on the Paramount lot. Robert Altman was kind of our mentor on the project. His grandson, Dana Altman, is still one of my producing partners. And it didn't get into Sundance. That's kind of the short version. But it was around that time that we had met a bunch of other indie filmmakers. So Dana kind of had the idea of, let's do something to team up with other filmmakers around the rest of the country, because he was in Omaha, which is where I'm originally from, but I was living in LA. But we didn't quite know how to manifest that until we all got rejected from Sundance. And we had heard of a couple individual filmmakers the year before, in January 1994, who didn't get into Sundance and did their own renegade screenings in Park City. So it was Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the South Park guys. Before South Park, they had done Cannibal the Musical. They had done their own little renegade screening when they didn't get into Sundance. James Marandino had a film called The Upstairs Neighbor. Same thing. He did a little renegade screening in Park City. And so we'd heard about these guys through various means. And then also there's a group of New York filmmakers, Matt Harrison and his friends at Film Crash. They had shown some shorts in Park City over the years. So we'd heard about these various experiments in sort of renegade screenings in Park City. And then it was actually Shane Coon who had directed a film called Redneck. That was his AFI thesis film, coincidentally also shot in Nebraska. He's the one who kind of married these ideas together and said, hey, why don't we get a group of us together and do a Renegade Festival in Park City? And so then we teamed up with another filmmaker, John Fitzgerald, and then our friend Paul Rackman said, "Hey, but I've got a short, so why don't we do shorts too?" So we wound up getting like a dozen features and a dozen shorts. There's a guy named Peter Baxter who produced one of the features. He got very involved with it, and he's the one who's really most still involved to this day, as well as Paul as well, and me to a much lesser degree. Anyway, the point is there was a whole group of us, and we combined our resources together. We all stayed in a condo in Salt Lake City. At first, our screenings were in Salt Lake City, and then there were some filmmakers that we had, Frank Hudak and Lisa Raven, who said, no, let's go to Park City itself, because we looked at the map and Salt Lake City was an inch away from Park City, and we thought, oh, everyone will just go there. But it turns out it's like an hour in the snow. And so Lisa and Frank and I drove up to Park City. We found a venue, literally a conference room at the Prospector Hotel, 30 feet down the hall from Sundance's main venue at the time. And so we started doing our screenings there and set our screenings for like 15 minutes after their screenings. So we would get they would always have this sold out line. So we just got this sold out audience to just like come into our room. But this was, part of it was just to contextualize it. Like, this is January 95, and this was a time of kind of the Hollywoodization of independent film. Miramax become part of Disney. Fine Line had become part of Warner Brothers. Fox was getting ready to launch Fox Searchlight. It was all the studios were starting to, see dollar signs in indie film. This was when Harvey Weinstein was going to Sundance and sponsoring Sundance and doing all kinds of horrible things there. That was that era. And so Sundance was kind of along for the ride. They were going, woohoo, we're going Hollywood. So they started to show more films by second-time directors and films with bigger budgets and bigger stars and films that already had distribution or were, silently already had distribution. And so they kind of left behind this niche of the first-time indie filmmakers working on low budget with no distribution. All of us had been influenced very much by and inspired by kind of that first generation of Sundance filmmakers, Steven Soderbergh in '89, and Robert Rodriguez and Richard Linklater and Allison Anders, that crew. And at the time, there were a lot fewer film festivals. This was South by was just starting films at that point, but they hadn't really taken off in terms of the film world. Tribeca hadn't started yet. And most regional festivals, and there were a lot of good ones then, and international festivals, they would just take that Sundance catalog and just use it as their template for what they would program. So those Sundance filmmakers would play for a year at every festival. And so this was by starting Slamdance, we kind of broke that hegemony. We broke that mold. And so our film started to get into other festivals, and it was around that same time again that South by was starting. The Hamptons Film Festival started around that time. New York Underground, Chicago Underground, LA, what was then called the LA Independent Film Festival. We all kind of started around that year because I think we all recognized that there was this Sundance hegemony and there was a much greater demand too. There were a lot more indie films being made, and Sundance also didn't show that many films at that time. They really only had one main section. So then Sundance responded a year later and added a whole other section, and then these other films festivals really kind of took off as well.
How did Sundance take you guys starting a rival film festival right down the street?
They weren't happy. Redford at one point called us parasites. Which he was right, of course. But we always said, we were like the beautiful moss on the oak tree that just made the whole forest look better, And it was a symbiotic relationship, which I think eventually they figured out. But that was the best street cred we could ever get. I mean, honestly, the press was turning on Sundance at around that time too, for all these excesses. And so we were kind of the cool, hip, underground punk kids, in the corner. And so we kind of became the press darlings, right from the get-go, which drove Sundance even crazier, So they literally tried to run us out of town for 30 years on and off. um, but we eventually figured out that a lot of our first, because our Slamdance was, to this day, is still focused on first-time directors with limited budgets and no distribution. And a lot of our filmmakers, then their second films, or if their short was at Sundance, then their feature would go to, if their short was at Slamdance, their feature would go to Sundance. Their second films would go there. And those were the filmmakers that would do very well at Sundance because they'd been to Park City. They knew how to hire a publicist. They knew how to stay in a condo. They knew what the weather was like there. And so a lot of the great filmmakers that we've had wound up becoming great Sundance filmmakers too.
They're able to do the networking in Sundance while actually being there for a reason, I guess, if you want to call it that. Like they're not just showing up there as tourists. So it's a definitely, well, not to overuse the term, but definitely a subversive way to get yourself, quote unquote, into Sundance without being in Sundance. I mean, I know that it's evolved over the last 30 years or so. How's the Slamdance Film Festival evolved, or has it stayed kind of true to its roots over the past 3 decades?
In most regards, it stayed about the same. We never really got too big by design. We tried to stay small. So our main focus is still on first-time directors and limited budgets and no distribution. That's still kind of our main core, sections. The big change geographically is that we kind of saw the writing on the wall that Sundance was going to move. And sure enough, next year will be Sundance's last year in Park City. Then they're moving to Boulder. We didn't really know where they were moving to, but we moved to LA this past year. And for much the same reason that Sundance moved, which is that it was just getting too expensive in Park City. Filmmakers couldn't stay there. They couldn't get there. Park City itself didn't particularly want either festival because it was the height of ski season. So all these film people who don't ski were taking all the condo spots of the ski resort. So they hated us. And it was just becoming a big mess there. Traffic was a mess and everything. And at the same time, I mean, we were always kind of based in LA. Most of us live here and our office is here. And we had been doing events in LA on and off for 30 years anyway, like not during the festival time, but during other parts of the year, various screenings and other events and parties and things. So we kind of know LA. So, but also LA had a vacuum. The LA Film Festival shut down a few years ago. Outfest shut down a few years ago. So this seemed, COVID was over. So this seemed like the time to come to LA and do our thing. And so it went very well. We were in West Hollywood last year. I'm not sure exactly where we'll be next year, but I think still in LA. When Sundance moves to Boulder, I don't know. Maybe we'll go there too. Maybe we'll stay in LA. We really take it as a year by year decision. So, which I think has been good for us to sort of be a little bit nimble and flexible that way.
And like there were always some unique things about Slamdance that I would read about, and I don't know if these are legend or myth, but like the idea of like the hot tub summits and things like that.
We did that for well over 10 years, which was a panel discussion in a hot tub. And usually I was the one that was leading that. But we would do fun things like that. Because again, first of all of us who run Slamdance one way or another are alumni of the festival. We're all filmmakers. Our motto is by filmmakers for filmmakers. And so we would go to other film festivals around the world and see, okay, well, what works best at film festivals? And what are the things we want to emulate and start at Slamdance? And so really what's come of that is there's a Slamdance vibe that's very unique and different than I think most other festivals, which is very supportive and non-judgmental and non-competitive. I mean, we have awards, but it's everyone are very supportive and very collaborative. A lot of filmmakers have met collaboration partners. Chris Nolan met Wally Pfister. Anyway, Wally, his DP at Slamdance, and then they went on to make 10 films together. I've met producers and DPs on my last 3 films at Slamdance. Directors meet actors there all the time. Directors will collaborate with other directors and do projects together. And we kind of realized like that vibe, that Slamdance vibe, which is a little bit indefinable, can exist no matter where we are physically. And we had exactly that same vibe in LA last year. And also part of that is that Slamdance alumni, like as soon as you show a film at Slamdance, the next year you're invited to become a programmer. So there's a constant churn in programming. And so, the Russo brothers were programmers for 3 years. Chris Nolan's wife, Emma Thomas, who's his producing partner, Dame Emma now, sorry, she was a programmer for 2 or 3 years. Ryan Johnson was a programmer for a year. So so this is a tradition that goes back really since our founding, and because of that, the ties among Slamdance filmmakers tend to be a little stronger than just okay, you go to a film festival for a week, you make a bunch of friends, and then you leave. No, we make a point of keeping that community together even beyond the life of the festival itself.
Is this kind of where you saw yourself being when you first got into this industry?
No, in fact, my wife warned me, and my filmmaker partner at the time warned me, like, do you want to be a filmmaker or do you want to be a film festival programmer? And I was like, I want to be a filmmaker. And then 7 years later, I was still heavily involved with Slamdance. And then, and then I really had to make a conscious effort to kind of take a step back from it. Because again, by then we had enough other alumni that were keeping the organization alive and keeping it true to its original roots.
You created a movement for all of these, like, obviously well-known filmmakers. When I first got out of film school, I was discovering kind of what kind of a filmmaker I wanted to be and whether or not I wanted to work in the industry and blah, blah, blah. And I've balanced between both. But I discovered your book and people like, Joshua Caldwell and Jim Cummings and people like that who were starting to put together there you go, the Cheerful Subversive Guide. This is a must read, by the way. I'm not going to try to plug it too much, but you have to buy this book. If you do not have this book, you should pick it up tomorrow if you want to be an independent filmmaker. It is effectively like a guidebook for putting this project, putting any kind of a film together. I would even say a higher budgeted indie film could still follow these techniques and find itself. And it was things like that that actually made me take a look back and go like, oh wait, you can do it this way instead of doing it the way that we had been taught even in film school, where you learn the technical side of things, but then we were always talking about trailers and location PAs and all this other stuff, all the infrastructure that goes into making a movie. And you think to yourself, wow, this is why budgets go through the roof and why sometimes people can't get their films made. And that was one of the things that we discovered early on making films was it was just so hard to get people to believe in someone who had never made a film before. And then I picked up your book, and I was like, oh, okay, but you don't need that. You don't need someone to believe in you to make the film. You just need to believe in yourself to make the film.
Well, that's the first step anyway. Yeah. But it's also the hardest. It's like convincing yourself like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. And sometimes you need to go through a whole crowdfunding campaign and convince 300 other people before you really believe it yourself. And then you're like, oh, okay, I guess we are doing this thing.
Part of it too, though, isn't it? Because the crowdfunding is the belief in yourself to say like, okay, because you're going to have an audience for this film anyway, right? Like you can play it for your mom and your dad and your friends, but in the end, you're hoping that more people are going to see this film anyway. So the crowd funding, but more like the crowd building, is really an essential part of this indie spirit. Like you can't just live on breadsticks alone and expect a distributor to come along and say, yep, you have the right check marks to make your thing happen.
Yeah, and I've really kind of thought about it a bit philosophically too, because if you're making an indie feature and it's 90 minutes long, these days that's 90 minutes of disposable content. It's not even film anymore. People just call it content. And you're like, really? I spent 5 to 7 years, writing the script, raising the money, 3 weeks shooting, a year in post-production, a year in film festivals, a year trying to get distribution, a year selling getting the film, promoting the film, another year suing your distributor, and then 25 years trying to get the rights back and archive it and get it redistributed. And this becomes each of these films becomes like a 30 to 40 year proposition, all for 90 minutes of, content. So if you think about it like that, it's hard to justify, it's hard to rationalize. But if you think about it as, oh, but I had 300 crowdfunders, I had 30 crew, I had 20 cast, I had, another 20 people working in post-production. I had people at every festival involved, audiences, festival volunteers, every theater, screening the film, getting them involved. And every audience, every film critic, like you realize, no, there were like 1,000 people involved with this project one way or another, and it becomes 1,000-person community-based art project over 30 years. And if you then kind of think about it in that kind of more holistic terms, then it kind of makes a bit more sense. Like, oh, this is why we spent so long making this thing, is because it's not just my film, it's our film. And it's whatever comes of it, that we've made something interesting and for a lot of people to get involved with, even if they were only involved for 90 minutes, but they took something home with them one way or another, then it becomes a bit more rational.
And of course, that takes back to like the 18 and a half movie where, you made it during a pandemic and then you had to take a break. Yeah. Then you had to take a short break because you got completely shut down, right?
A 6-month healthy hiatus. Yeah.
A healthy hiatus, and then come back and refilm it. Like I still see stuff on Instagram about a screening somewhere, even to this day, and the movie's available digitally and everything else, but you're still doing theatrical screenings, or you were at least last time, a little bit ago, still having theatrical screenings.
Yeah, and screenings on college campuses, and it just started screening on Canopy. There's another AVOD thing called Momitu that we discovered that we were on, and then became friends with them, and then they put us on. They started promoting the film, and it turns out that's hardwired into every Vizio TV, which is now owned by Walmart. So like you walk into a Walmart, flip a switch, and there's our movie, which is kind of bizarre. But they've been great and very supportive and put me on their podcast and things like that. So yeah, these things, like I said, they don't end. Meanwhile, we just fired one distributor and we're looking for a new one all over again. So because while we were very successful distribution wise in the US and the UK, it has not sold anywhere outside the US or the UK, outside North America and Great Britain. So, and India, it sold in India, but it hasn't started been exhibited in India yet, but that's happening this year. So that'll be our next big thing. But the whole rest of the world, we haven't sold, except airlines. We ran internationally to like 11 different airlines around the world. But anyway, the point is, yeah, there's still, there's still a lot of milk to get out of that dead horse that we're beating,
And and what's incentivizing you to keep like milking that cow, so to speak? Because is it to get more financial money back, or is it just to keep it alive and to honor that system that you're saying?
It's less about the money, but also you don't want to think back and go, oh, wait a minute, why we never sold it to France? Why didn't we sell France? Like this, we know it played, and why didn't we sell it to Brazil? We played festivals in a lot of these places in Spain, Brazil, Canada. So we know there's an appetite for it. Like it'd be one thing if we knew the film people there didn't like it, or if it was like only American. But no, it did really well festival wise in Australia and Canada, in Spain, Brazil, and the UK, and just so we know there's a market for it. So it's just, why would I deny most of the world, our great art?
So what's 18 and a half about?
It is a Watergate thriller / comedy about a young transcriber in the Nixon White House who gets a hold of the missing 18-and-a-half-minute gap in the Watergate tapes, and she tries to leak it to a reporter, and they meet at a seaside motel where they run afoul of hippies, swingers, and nefarious people out to get them. And has a great cast, Willa Fitzgerald and John Magaro, Vondi Curtis Hall, Kathy Curtin, Sullivan Jones, Richard Kind is in it. Second film I did with Richard, and then great voice talents: Bruce Campbell as Nixon, John Cryer, Ted Raimi. So all kinds of fun people are in it. Lloyd Kaufman has a tiny cameo in the film. So it's fun, and you don't need to know much about Watergate. It's because it's really more character based. It's historical fiction. It's not a documentary, that's for sure. But that said, the DVD does also have a almost 2-hour long making of behind the scenes documentary. So I encourage people to watch that as well.
And I'll give a quick review of that. The documentary itself is an amazing film in and of itself. If you watch the movie and then you watch the documentary, you're kind of like, oh my goodness! Like essentially, you could save yourself probably $20,000 worth of film school by watching a documentary like this, because you'd effectively be able to probably make a movie with what you learn through it. And it's really interesting because it ties into themes. It ties out obviously into contemporary themes, and that historical fiction side of things really plays in, because you go, well, it's a really wonderfully placed story, because it almost fills the gap of, well, could this have actually happened?
Yeah. We call it speculative historical fiction. My writing partner Daniel Moya and I, we really talked about this a lot. Like, there's kind of two ways to do historical fiction. One is you kind of the Tarantino route, where you kind of rewrite history, and by the end of the movie, you're in a totally different world. Hitler's dead, Manson killed the wrong people. You've diverged into a different reality, and then there's another school of thought of doing speculative historical fiction, where the thing that is fictional could have happened in theory, because by the end of the movie you kind of reset to the timeline that and that was what we wanted to do on this. I'm sure there are academics who have kind of discussed this in fiction and in literature too. I'm sure it happens, but for film, that was kind of what we wanted to do with 18 and a half. Since finishing the film, we've shown it to people that really worked on the Watergate committee and were real serious scholars of Watergate, and they're like, yeah, this is as likely as anything else, because it really is a mystery to this day. What was on the 18.5 minute gap? Who deleted it? And why did they delete it? And the bottom line is, no one will probably ever really find those things out, because most of the players are now dead. So we're like, well, we'll just come up with an explanation that is as plausible as anything else, and then just have fun with it, because we're not pretending it's real, but it could be.
It's like you said, you're telling a fictional story that is fitting into a historical reference, which is very interesting, because in terms of movie making, when you have to, economy of scale in terms of movies, in terms of what you have to tell the audience, most people have heard the word Watergate before. So the moment you say that, everybody kind of has, especially in North America, have that bell in their head of like what that actually means, and they know it's not just a nice hotel in New York, in Washington.
But it is the one scandal that everyone around the world knows about. That's the thing. That's the interesting thing too that we found when we went to all these festivals internationally, is that everyone could relate to it, and they've all heard of Nixon, they've all heard of Watergate, but they can also, when we showed it in Brazil, everyone's like, oh, this is just like Bolsonaro. When we were in the UK, everyone was like, oh, this is just like the Boris Johnson scandal that was going on then. So everyone, in Spain, everyone's like, Franco. Everyone's got their Nixon stories or Nixon analogies. So it's amazing how many people could relate to it internationally.
The fact that the word gate is a thing that's used to describe a political scandal now, right?
Exactly. And we, and also, not for nothing, but we made this film during the first Trump administration, and, we didn't know exactly how many impeachments he would get, but we kind of figured there'd be at least one or two. And so this was a way to sort of comment on contemporary American issues without being sort of hyper-specific in time. This is a problem. If you make a contemporary satire, you've got to watch it right then. But indie film has this long tail. Not everyone's going to see it within that first year. It may take you a couple of years to make it even. So, but if you do something that's historical fiction, in a weird way, it can stay timely and relevant into, because there's always going to be something you can relate to it in terms of contemporary politics, whether it was Biden or Trump second term, and that was one of the interesting things was, and I don't know if you picked up on this in the making of documentary, but when the January 6th committee came out and Cassidy Hutchinson gave her testimony, it was one of my executive producers was like, "Oh my God, this is just like the movie. A young woman, 25 years old, working in the White House, speaking truth to power," and that's literally kind of what happens in our movie, and how. And part of it is because I had worked in DC before, and I knew that young 25-year-olds can have a lot of power and can speak truth to power if they're in the right place at the right time. And that's been a theme in Washington for many years. So in not knowing exactly what would happen in the Trump administration, we kind of had a feeling that that was a recurring theme that would be resonant for years to come.
Yeah, and by setting, like you said, by setting it historically, you can kind of timestamp it to something without without losing the zeitgeist of the moment. Like if I made a movie today about what's happening today, it might not. It would still take 2 to 3 years for it to come out. So whatever revelation I'm trying to make today might not have the same resonance in 3 years, because it might have been superseded by 50 other things, and whereas you've timestamped it to something that the story's not going to change. The Watergate scandal is still going to exist. Yeah. And so, like, from the indie film standpoint, what was that your impetus going, like, what was the germ of this thing to get 18½ off? Like, were you watching Watergate or something like that, and all of a sudden you're like, what if?
In our case, it goes back to the last film I made, which was called Bernard and Huey, which is another great film I hope everyone sees. And that we had just wrapped production on that literally the day Trump got elected the first time around in 2016. And then I went out to Shelter Island, which is the tip of Long Island outside New York, which is where our screenwriter, Jules Feiffer, who was a legendary Pulitzer, Oscar, Obie-winning, Tony-nominated cartoonist, but also screenwriter. He wrote Carnal Knowledge, as well as Popeye. Anyway, he had written Bernard and Huey, so I went out to show him dailies for it. But of course, inevitably, we were talking about Trump's election and comparisons to Nixon. Pfeiffer largely won his Pulitzer based on his political cartoons about Watergate and about Nixon. So, he had a lot to say about that. And anyway, so we kind of had that on my mind. And I was with my friend Terry, who had been an indie filmmaker in LA for many years, but had moved out to kind of that same area on the eastern tip of Long Island a few years earlier, because his grandmother had basically left him a motel to run, a seaside motel in Greenport, New York. He was with me. He had driven me over to see Pfeiffer, so we were all talking about Watergate together. Then we go back to Terry's motel, the Silver Sands Motel, and Terry was very savvy. He had kept it. I mean, it's a working motel in the summer, but he kept it very vintage looking, because he knew he could rent it out to fashion photographers from like Harper's and Vogue and all the high-end fashion places, and music videos and commercials. But he'd never let a feature shoot there. And because we sort of had Watergate on the mind, I'm like, Terry, this looks like 1974 here. This is a perfect 70s location. And he said, well, look, he'd known me, for 30 years. If you come up with an idea, I'll let you shoot on the property, and everyone can stay here for free, basically. So then I had to figure out, well, how do you tell a Watergate story in a seaside motel? So we kind of transposed it to Maryland instead of New York, but that made sense. And then I teamed up with his writing partner, Daniel Moya, who later became a producing partner on the film. Coincidentally, his aunt and uncle owned this diner that was literally just down the street from the motel. They knew Terry. And so then we had two locations, and we had a diner and we had a motel. And if the film gods, give you two locations, you make a movie, you write a movie about it. And really there's no excuse not to at that point. Because honestly, locations, because it's two things. I mean, one is that everyone always warns you, don't do a period movie on a low budget. Oh, it's expensive. You can't do it. But even on Bernard and Huey, we had shot about 10% of the movie as flashbacks to like the mid 80s. And we figured out ways to do that on the cheap. So all of a sudden, like, shooting period didn't scare me anymore. But also, if you have a period location, that's 90% of the production design, really. I mean, even though we had a great production designer as well. So there was kind of no reason not to. But also in general, locations tend to be the most variable element in an indie film budget, like they're either free or they're really expensive. And sometimes you don't always know until afterwards, when you get a bill for cleanup or damage or something like that. So when you're starting with the premise that, hey, we've got 95% of our locations already covered, essentially, then you can it's much easier to predict what your budget's going to be and how much you need to raise to pay for the cast and crew, because those are pretty fixed costs.
It would be more romantic if they stayed together.
The door would not stay afloat.
It's a movie, not a documentary.
Are you insane, bro? It was a real life tragedy.
Why are you so obsessed with tragedy?
Here's an idea. Why don't the two of you take your hot takes to Pelleplat? They're holding a contest for people like you. Plus, there's cash prizes.
Game on.
So, who won?
Straight away.
We both won. Yeah, we found our people.
Perfect. By the way, what about the end of Inception?
Don't even.
No,
I know you're
listen,
gonna start,
no,
but
I
told
no, you need to look at
Pelleplat Writing Challenges, where passionate minds meet. Join today at pelleplat.com.
I like how you're talking about, that's where the merging of the idea comes from. It's like, I've got an idea about a story about Watergate, and I've got a location. And now we have to marry these two together and figure out what's a good story to tell within that framework.
And, and look, that goes back to my very first film, Omaha the Movie. A friend of mine who was a musician said, hey, I found this place called Carhenge, an exact replica of Stonehenge built out of old American cars stuck in the ground in western Nebraska. Let's shoot a music video. And I was like, no, that's a great location. Let's shoot a feature film there. And so sure enough, we were able to shoot at Carhenge. And to this day, I think we're the only feature that has shot there. So we wrote the script around that.
And that's something I know in your book, you basically talk about that is like, where does the movie start from? And it starts from, what can I get for free? What can I get with the resources I have available to me at this moment? Not trying to create a story that you then have to figure out the logistics for.
Exactly. That's not the only way to do it, but it is certainly one way.
There's no rules, right? Just tools. You wrote a script for it. You got Willa Fitzgerald, and you had already done a movie with Richard Kind and so on. So those are some big names to bring into the mix. You have a lot of really good actors in this film, and from a person who's maybe not got that connection or something like that. Like, you've got lots of connections in the industry and so on. So you're able to pull these kind of cast members together to make this thing work. What would you do if you had to tell someone who doesn't have that connection to those same cast how to put something like this together?
There's a chapter about it in the book, how to get A-list actors in a micro-budget film or something like that. Part of it is to start with a script with really good parts. The script doesn't have to be good. The parts have to be good, because actors only read, my line, my line, my line, flip, 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 my line, my line, my line. So the parts have to be good, and and there's all kinds of things to define what is good, but you have to start with that premise that there are good parts in the film, and then one of the things I talk about is developing relationships, not so much with actors themselves, although that's sometimes helpful, but also with talent agents and talent managers, because if you are friends with a talent agent, they may have 20 clients. So, even though that one actor that you're friends with all of a sudden may be busy, you're booked on a Spielberg movie, if you're friends with the agent, they've got 19 other clients. And so to start to develop those relationships with assistants and interns at those agencies, because one guy who was an assistant at Gersh 25 years ago, when we were hanging out in the copy room making flyers for Slamdance, he's now the head of talent at Gersh. And I could call him up and say, hey man, we're shooting in 3 days. We need a guy who's 50 to 70, preferably based in New York. And he's like, okay, how's Vondi Curtis Hall? And I was like, Emmy winner Vondi Curtis Hall? He's hired. Send him the script, And so just having those, relationships that you can just call at the last minute is really key. But the other thing too that I talk about in the book is, actors and especially their agents are motivated by two things. And everybody assumes it's one thing, which is money, but it's not. That's only one thing. But the other thing is insecurity. Actors want to work. actors like to act, and also agents like to have their clients working, because if the clients aren't working, that means they're calling them every day. What's my next gig? What's my next gig? You're fired. So so there's this insecurity for both the actors as well as their reps. And this is something that goes back to what Robert Altman taught us, which is, set a start date, tell everyone the train's leaving the station, and are you on board or not? And so, that start date may be March 30th, 2020. What could possibly go wrong in March of 2020? But the point is, the closer you get to that date, in a weird way, the more likely you are to get a higher level of actor, because if they're available, actors love to work. Richard Kind, you got craft service, he'll show up, if he's available. If he's not available, forget it, but you don't know until you ask. So, and then part of it was also, we had voiceover parts, or voice performance parts, I should say, which are much easier for actors to schedule, because it's kind of, you can kind of do it anytime, anywhere. And especially, we figured out how to do it over Zoom, which made it even easier. That was something we did during that 6-month pandemic pause, is we wound up recording our voice performances over Zoom, which was great at a time when actors weren't acting and directors weren't directing, and we were able to creatively keep moving forward. So making it simple for them without, they literally didn't have to put on pants to do that stuff. So, but they were all interested, legit interested in it. Bruce and Ted were huge Watergate aficionados, at which I didn't know until we talked to them. John Cryer, who I've known, tangentially for a long time, but had never worked together. I knew he was, politically motivated, and this was an easy thing for him to do. He has a nice microphone in his house, so easy peasy.
Yeah, and it sounds you're saying it's kind of like the subject material is obviously intriguing enough to get someone to go, oh, I'm interested in at least looking at it.
Having, broadly speaking, having a pedigree gets their attention, and that could be, I did one film called Between Us that was an adaptation of a hit off-Broadway play, so everyone's like, ooh, off-Broadway play. Having a script by Jules Feiffer, that got people's attention. And then, even though 18 and a half was 100% original screenplay, in a weird way, Watergate was the pedigree. It's like, oh, it's a Watergate film. Oh, I get to play Nixon. These were sort of known elements, or at least around the genre, that was enough of a hook to get people's attention.
It's that unique hook that you're layering on top of the other experiences that you've had, and the other, say, the compound interest of what you've built as a career.
Yeah, and exactly. And yeah, and not for nothing, a lot of these actors know me or know of me or have heard of Slamdance, or are Kelly Reichardt is the one who recommended John Magaro to me. So he figures, well, if Kelly recommended me to Dan, I guess Dan must be okay, So, so it's my connections to other filmmakers, over the years also helps. Lucky McKee recommended working with Willa Fitzgerald, even though I hadn't heard of her, and she's like, oh, well, Lucky, then that's okay. So, and these are not huge connections that I have in the industry, but they're a little deeper than that. I know a lot of directors, and I've gotten to know a lot of talent agents and managers over the years, but it's not like I know a lot of actors, really. So
you have a library of films. You do have Slamdance. These are all interesting. Wouldn't you like to make a movie with the guy who is part of the Slamdance Film Festival?
And then they do, and then they're like, well, yeah,
But it's still that conceptual, and this is something that when I've taught at film schools before as well, and so on, where you're talking to people like, how do I get into the industry? I said, well, you just kind of do, and then you let the world catch up to you a little bit in terms of what you're doing. There's so many people out there who, especially getting started out, who are like, oh, I want to be a director, and they expect their first film to go to Sundance or South by Southwest or get into something big, and if it doesn't, or if they can't make a film at that level, it's almost like they don't even want to start. We're all trying to make the best film we can possibly make out of the gate. But there's also something about just putting an idea down on paper, putting the resources together to make the film, and then just using that as this is step one. I worked with some local actors here who were really, brought what they could bring. And then my second film, some people had seen the first film, and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And then it builds from there. And I think that's something that you're sort of saying that spits in the face of that idea of like, you have to make your best film right out of the gate. And if it doesn't hit Sundance, your career is, you can't be that overnight wonder that everybody's talking about.
No, you just have to build a body of work that cumulatively adds up to something that they go, oh, well, you keep making films and you put them out, which is not for nothing. Because any idiot can make a film. It's getting people to see the film. It takes a special kind of idiot.
The academic side of things, you're obviously, you teach at Chapman.
Yeah, the last couple semesters I've done like 1 or 2 classes a semester at Chapman. Well, it's an hour commute, so I'm only going there 1 day a week. But then I've guest lectured at about 70 film schools around the world, really. And then, yeah, I think you were getting at, I've started something I've done on the last couple of films is started to workshop screenplays at film schools. So with 18 and a half, we did a really nice workshop at University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. And we got a lot of really great ideas out of that. And then on my next script, which I can't really say too much about, we just did a workshop at Elon University in North Carolina. And that was where I had done some guest lecturing. And so they knew me there. And that was great. Got a bunch of students to read it, come up with notes and suggestions and thoughts, and got some really great ideas out of that. I talk about this, I think, a little bit in the book, that there's been a tendency, a little bit of overlabification. Everyone gets, oh, I must get into the Sundance lab. I must get into this other lab, and this and that. And it can really slow you down because those applications take a long time. Even if you get in, and great, congratulations, you got into a Sundance lab. They're all good. But how much time did you waste in just applying to those labs? And even if you do get in, you can only really go if you don't have kids to take care of, or or family, or a job. So they're a little bit sort of by their nature elitist in kind of the time commitments they take, even if you do get in. So my theory is kind of self-labbing. Whether it's at a local film school, or I've done some of my early readings on some of my scripts. We did it at a theater company in Omaha, where I was friends with those people. Kind of the same idea, like, well, let's just do it ourselves. Let's just kind of workshop it together, get a bunch of people together and come up, spitball ideas and see if we can make the script better. You're not wasting 9 months just to find out you got rejected from a lab, only to then apply to another lab. So I also find it sort of somewhat morally reprehensible when you've got all these people who have been to some great film schools, UCLA, NYU, USC, who then take those spots at those labs. And I'm like, hang on a second. Why do you need a lab if you just went to film school? Like, labs make a lot of sense if you haven't been to film school. Great. Fantastic. But if you've been to film school, you just had 3 years of labbing. You know how to make films. You went to film school. Then it just becomes pedigree, and it becomes, a notch on your belt to get the film made. But meanwhile, some kid in Iowa or Nebraska or Tennessee isn't getting that slot. And so it becomes sort of this self-fulfilling elitist prophecy, not to besmirch people that have gone to them, but, really, you're taking a spot that could have gone to someone else.
Like, obviously, the main purpose is to make the script better. And it's, I know you say this a lot in your book. It's like, you want to have an excellent script to make the film work. One person once told me, you can't have a bad script and it gets better in prep. It has to start really good. It'll get whittled in prep, and it'll turn it, your dreams will be destroyed. Yeah, it could get worse in prep because of logistics and locations and cutting scenes and days and things like that. But it's very difficult to make a bad script good through the production process. It has to come from the start and work its way back. And that's also the least expensive way to make a really good movie, is to actually have a very good script and then work from there.
Exactly. And then the other challenge, the reason why I do these things in sort of interesting places, is that if you do a reading in LA or New York, there's a lot of pressure on it. All the actors that you get for those readings want to be in the movie. All the financiers that come to those readings get bored and then won't give you financing, or, just by the nature of it. But if you do it in kind of, a college setting somewhere in the middle of nowhere, if it goes well, great. You get great notes from it. If it goes badly, no one has to know.
And most of the time, the students are just happy to read a script.
Yeah, no, for them, it's great. They get to be a part of a real production or something that is going, that has the potential to go into production, and they get a credit for it. The school gets a credit for it, and it's a nice real world thing that they can do. I mean, this kind of whole idea got again inspired a little bit by Robert Altman, who made Secret Honor at University of Michigan. Got a bunch of students together, got Philip Baker Hall in this basically one man play adaptation. I think it had been a play, and it was also a Nixon film. They did it at the University of Michigan with a bunch of students, and I was like, oh, that was a really smart way to make a movie, and great experience for the students, great experience, he got the film made. And I know a lot of filmmakers who are also academics who are doing things like that. It's whether it was Alex Rockwell at NYU for many years was making films with his students, my friend Eugene Martin at University of North Texas, a lot of filmmakers, who have those second careers as academics, will kind of take that approach as well.
And that academic idea of because you hit this on the at the start, independent filmmaking is not a rich person's. It's a very difficult way to get wealthy or to become financially successful, and so. If you're in it for that, there are much easier ways to make money. But but if you love making independent film, what can you do to sustain yourself? And the academic realm is actually might be a very good way. As I think Ethan Hawke said, if you can't get excited about teaching someone how to act, you shouldn't be an actor, because it's an art form that is probably best prescribed by turning your experiences into curriculum somewhere. Which I think you've said that a couple of times too, where it's like something about like turning failure into curriculum, or turning your lessons into turning your failures into lessons.
I don't know if I have said that, but I will now. So,
or maybe use that now. Well, it feels like by sharing your experiences, you're teaching other people, and it's not a follow my path. This is the way to the Golden Arches and the Academy Award. But it's here's a path I took. You could probably find your own path within that path that I've taken that might help you solve the problems that you can't solve yourself or that you haven't figured out yet.
And I also emphasize that, the path is not always to make an 90-minute indie feature and do exactly what I've done, but I've also been able to be a little bit nimble enough with whatever new technology or new media comes along to, take advantage of it if I can. And, and hey, if it doesn't work as a screenplay, maybe it works as a graphic novel. If it doesn't work as a graphic novel, maybe it's a Broadway musical. And to be a little bit media agnostic and technology agnostic about some of these things, which also is a little bit startling sometimes to film students who are thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, whether it's a feature, or episodic, or whatever the thing is in their head. And you're like, well, maybe it's that, but then again, maybe it's something completely different.
Yeah, and I was producing a couple of vertical series for a short period of time, which at first felt very much like I was like, oh, this isn't what I got into filmmaking for. But then you start to realize, oh no, there's a medium here. It's not the same type of storytelling, but it's the medium of storytelling.
Exactly. It's acting, it's directing, it's storytelling, it's cinematography, it's editing. I hadn't even heard of verticals until some of my Chinese students in the MFA program at Chapman started telling me, about it, and it was like, oh, that's this thing. That's what the thing that Quibi was supposed to be, and then now it's finally catching up in America, and it's like, it's the one growth element in LA filmmaking right now, are these, vertical things or whatever they're called. But they're the ones renting studio space in LA right now.
And that's maybe just as a question about that academic process, when I went to film school, I'm not sure, many years ago, it's like you went to film school to learn to handle the equipment, like to get access to the equipment, to get access to all these things, and to be taught by someone who knew what they were talking about how to use the equipment properly. And then, you learned how to write a screenplay, and then you wrote a screenplay. But all of that now is sort of, obviously knowledge is available openly and freely. So where does the academic side of film school fit into all of this, if at all, anymore? Because you teach at schools, and I do some teaching as well at film schools here locally.
You're right. What is the role of film school when you've got YouTube Film School? And I know some film students think, oh, no, but it's about the connections. That's why I have to go to USC or I have to go to this place or that place. And I'm like, really? Is that? I don't know. I went to USC and made very few connections there. So I don't know how true that is. But at least that is a reason, that is there's some rationale to that distinguishes it from YouTube film school. But I think part of it is what can you learn from older unemployed filmmakers? And the has-beens and the wannabes that teach at film school, that always have taught at film school. Yeah, and that's why I try to not make it about it's about the camera or the editing software, because all that's going to change, and it will change, and the medium is going to change. Is it projected? Is it not projected? You could be making, in 20 years, maybe the same film school students are making, Google contact lens content or who knows what. But really more talk about on the one hand, what is the art that we're making, and, and how and why do we do that? But also the kind of the philosophy, and again, this goes back to me, especially because most of the classes I'm teaching are actually producing classes. They're not directing classes. For whatever reason, I'm teaching in the producing program at Chapman. And so it's okay, if someone gives you a set of rules, what are the ways to get around them? What are the loopholes? How do you approach problem solving? I always give these students, okay, these are the obstructions that are going to happen on your set. You're going to, an actor's going to get kicked in the head by a horse. You're going to lose your equipment. A camera's going to fall on top of another camera. What do you do? What is your approach? How do you then talk to your investors to get more money to get, to fix that problem? And what is that conversation like? And what is that attitude like? Because those things are never going to change, and that's why it's good to have a little bit of a basis in film history to go, okay, in the 1920s, and when they were stealing cameras from the studio to shoot B movies on weekends, what were the lessons we can take from that? In the 1930s, when they were in the height of the Depression and people were bringing live cows to give away to audiences on at theaters in the Midwest, what can we do that's like that now? Also the bad side of Hollywood, the Hollywood blacklist in the 50s, and how that destroyed the industry from within. What can we do preemptively to protect ourselves against that happening in the Trump administration? You go from giving away live cows to preventing the next blacklist in a heartbeat. But those are the things that transcend what is the technology this week? Because as we know, camera technology changes every year, editing technology changes every 2 years. Hard drives change. DCPs change. So it's not as important to learn the real mechanics of that. But if you're going to film school to learn cinematography, those lessons in optics and composition and framing are going to be relevant whether you're shooting horizontally on IMAX or an iPhone. And those lessons are still going to apply. But at the same time, if you can't afford film school, or it doesn't work for you in your life, then don't miss it either.
I mean, the curriculum you could find, it's more the idea of having that grounding in art history and film history that help define. It's not about necessarily how you do the story from a technical standpoint. It's more the what story are you telling, and and why. We could all tell the same joke, but it's a really seasoned comedian who knows the timing and figures out what from that comedian who has been to 1,000 comedy clubs and seen 1,000 comedians before, who's developing their timing and their voice through observing how other people have done it, and I wouldn't say imitating, but taking on influences that can help shape the voice that you have. Is there an optimistic future for independent film?
Yeah, an indie filmmaker recently who had just finished his film, he called me up. He said, Dan, I hear everyone saying this is the worst time to have an independent film out there. This is the worst time. And I was like, yeah, it is. But it's always the worst time. It never has there been a time where people didn't say it was the worst time. So it's no worse than it's ever been, and certainly no better than it's ever been either. So no, you just need to find sort of unique ways to connect with an audience. And however you do that, I mean, on 18 and a half, our biggest success really was in selling the film to airlines. We sold it to 11 different airlines, JetBlue, Virgin Atlantic, Singapore Air, Qatar. It's probably on that plane that the Qataris sold to Trump, Emirates, Air New Zealand, literally everywhere. And we made about 60% of our revenue from those airline sales. We actually made like real money from it. In a weird way, that was a way that we connected with audience. I mean, we also did 30 festivals and 60 city theatrical release too. But at the end of the day, a movie it's like the tree in the forest. If nobody sees it, it doesn't really exist. It's only when an audience sees it and connects with it, and you see that the audience is seeing it, and then you can engage with that audience one way or another. It's only then that the movie exists. It's just light and shadow and pixels. So you need to find a way to get it seen by any means necessary, and which is why I love film festivals, because that is one of the last places where you can. Almost every film festival will guarantee like at least some audience will actually see it, but also you can engage with that audience. If you wrote a comedy and you want to hear people laugh, you wrote a horror film, you want to hear them shriek, like you can only really do that with an audience. So even if you make a film for Netflix and 100 million people see it, but you never see that audience seeing it, did they really see it? There's no audience engagement, and so that's why I love film festivals, even more than theatrical screenings, which sometimes can be very lightly attended. But yeah, so I think there's still hope. Yeah, don't give up hope.
I'll sneak a question in there, a follow-up on that, because with 18 and a half, again, when we talked earlier about the fact that, it still feels like it's playing in festival, in some kind of a screening somewhere right now, because I always see you with a sandwich board on your chest, promoting it. But it feels like that long tail promotion of that film really has kept its life relevant, but not just because of the subject matter, but also is a bit of a roadmap for independent filmmakers to follow. Was that your intention from the beginning, or is that something that came out organically from just realizing that's how you needed to do it?
I mean, it's kind of what I've done with all my films. I milk the dead horse as long as I can, and until you sort of get taken over with emotional energy with the next film, and then that's how you know when to kind of start to give up on the last one a little bit. But I haven't really taken off on the next film yet. Hopefully I will be this year. So I've had time to devote to 18 and a half, but also it's been interesting, like discovering new markets, I guess, and media. So this is the first time I really discovered that there was a whole library market for indie films. And I wrote a big article for Filmmaker Magazine about it in the winter issue of Filmmaker Magazine about how we got the 18 and a half DVD kind of coincidentally. We kind of stumbled into like 75% of our DVD sales wound up coming from public libraries across North America, and we got it into like 800 libraries in something like 48 states and 5 provinces around Canada as well. And we just kind of stumbled into that world, but it opened up a whole like crazy world of tension between public libraries and academic libraries and streaming and DVD and what is the future of the library world. And libraries are on the front lines of the culture wars, especially in America. So it's there's a lot there that I hadn't even thought of. And talking to the folks at Filmmaker Magazine, no one else had thought of it either, really, in that context. So that's why they were eager for me to write about it. In the same way that on the previous film, that's what opened up the world of airlines to me, is I wrote a big story about that and then took a lot of that information and applied it to the next film, which was 18 and a half. But it's fun. Like, while everyone is complaining that, no one's going to theaters or you can't get indie films onto Netflix, meanwhile, I'm like finding all these other ways to connect with audiences that other people just aren't looking at.
There's something weird about seeing your movie, like a DVD of your movie in a library. Like we had that with our first film as well, where all of a sudden somebody took a photo and they'd seen it in a library in another city, and I was like, "What? It's in a library?" And I thought that is very cool. I was like, well, obviously, I know you can stream off libraries now too, but it's that there's that sort of you almost feel like, I almost felt like, oh, that's our blockbuster moment, right? Like seeing your film in a library is.
Yeah, libraries are the new blockbuster, So very literally, that's the only place you can rent a DVD sometimes.
It sounds like, I mean, obviously, movies take money to make, but your objective as an independent filmmaker is to if you have investors and things like that, they're hoping to get a return on their investment. But you're really, in order for that to happen, instead of bloating a budget out, you have to just keep exploring all of these interesting places that films can be seen and exploiting them when they present themselves, and sort of going, okay, well, there's libraries now, there's airlines, there's
oil rigs and prisons.
Prisons and academic, like schools and things like that, where some that are profitable, but maybe more like these are free marketing. These are like earned media, earned attention on the film that might, you might not necessarily make money on the academic screening, but you might make money on the fact that people heard about the academic screening.
Yeah, or they then pay you for a guest lecture and you make money on that, So so if you just narrowly think of box office revenue, it's you're putting yourself in a box, and you're not thinking about the rest of the world and the rest of. That's why I say, like, we still have most of the world that we have not distributed the film to, and there's a lot of potential there. So that's kind of the next goal, is to get it out there. But again, it takes time and effort to do that. None of this is easy. But as long as you're having fun doing it, you may as well.
If you can make it fun, then keep doing it. It looks like you're having a lot of fun doing it. I mean, you at least present that way. Maybe the Instagram world version of Dan Mirvish is looks like it's an enjoyable process. I mean, you're seeing the world with a film that you made and introducing it in interesting ways.
Yeah, and meeting people all over the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like this is living, right? Like you're living life and making a product, a content, if you will, that is allowing you the opportunity to have a eclectic and enjoyable life existence, and not being bankrupt in the process. So, last question, just sort of as a roundup. One of the questions we asked is, if you had any advice to give sort of your younger self, if you were starting today, what would you go back and tell yourself?
Well, the advice I give other people is to marry well. I did, so that was good. I followed my own advice back then, because you need a partner to go through these adventures in life, and preferably one that's not in the industry, because it's nice if they have some stability, even if you don't. But for myself, I think the biggest thing was, for a long time, I chased having an agent for myself. And then eventually, and it took a couple decades to figure this out, that I didn't really need that. What I needed was to develop relationships with talent agents, for the reasons I talked about earlier. That was actually more meaningful and useful in the long term than if I was represented. Because at the end of the day, agents can't really make money off an indie film director, and so they just don't have a motivation to help you. So don't chase that. Because again, it took me about 20 years to figure that out. I was like, oh yeah, I don't need that. So why spend time and effort looking for it? My writing partner on the Martin Eisenstadt project, Eitan Gorlin, once put it. He said, "Agents, I don't like them. I don't trust them. I use them when I need them." And I think what he was getting at was kind of a paradigm shift there, that if I have something to offer them, then they will be very responsive, which is to say, I have roles in my film for their actors. Again, it's not about the money, but I have roles and we're shooting on Sunday, then they will respond to me. If I'm begging them for an opportunity to get on their roster and maybe they make a phone call, then they have all the control and they're not going to give me anything. So it's about, what do you have to offer them that makes them come to you instead of you begging them. And that, once we kind of flipped that paradigm in our heads, it all made a lot more sense.
It feels like a much better way to live life too, is to be of service to others.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dan. We really appreciate it. We went a little over.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. Thanks for having me on. And just last reminder to everyone, watch 18 and a half. Buy my book, which is available in Chinese also, by the way. If you're in China, you can get the translation. And it's on audiobooks. If you like the sound of my voice, you can hear me talking for 14 hours reading the book. So,
and we'll put all the links in the show notes, and people can also find you on Instagram and all the other fun places.
Yes. yeah, find me and Substack. I have a Substack now too. Substack's the new MySpace. All right. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Dan.